In the last video I flattened and finished a large Beech Waney edge slab coffee tabletop, and in this video I'll be making a frame for it using some sapele. I bought these pieces from someone local to me. These were rough sawn and had lots of defects, but I was confident that I had enough to work with here to make a frame. To begin, I'd need to make two 450mm by 450mm squares. I first needed to prepare the wood, so I used a hand plane to clean up one edge of each piece, and then I could use that edge referenced against the table saw fence to cut pieces to roughly the right size. Next I could plane and then thickness plane all of the pieces to a consistent size, and they ended up being around 35mm square. Then I cut them all to length at the miter saw. I looked through the pieces to check for defects, and there were a couple of pieces that weren't as good as the rest, so I marked up those pieces for use at the top of the frame so that they'd be less visible once the tabletop is attached later. For the joinery I decided to cut some bridle joints, and to do that I'd use a tenon jig, which I made some time ago for my table saw. I hadn't used this in a while, so I first checked that it was square to the table, and it looked fine. I set my blade height to the thickness of one of the workpieces, and then I made a reference mark roughly a third of the way into one of the pieces. First I'd cut the mortises, so I lined up my blade to cut on the inside of the mark and made a cut. Then I rotated it 90 degrees and made another cut. Then I did the same on the other end too, and I did that for 4 of the 8 pieces, and here's how they looked with all of the cuts made. Next I could mark up the cuts for the tenons by positioning one of the uncut pieces end to end with one of the cut pieces, and I used a marking knife to make small indentations for where the tenon cuts needed to be made. I could then line up the blade with the outside of those knife marks and make the cuts. I could then butt them together again to check that the mortise would fit inside the tenon, and it looked good, so with the fence still set I cut the rest of the pieces too. And then I could remove all the waste material from both the mortises and the tenons by adjusting the fence and taking multiple passes through the blade. I used my marking knife and a chisel to clean up all of the joinery because my table saw blade doesn't have square teeth, so it had left some small ridges where I'd made the cuts. I find working with a chisel for cleaning up joints like this really enjoyable. Then I could do a test fit and the pieces came together really nicely. A little tight perhaps, but not so tight that they wouldn't go together. Next I could assemble the 2 squares, so I applied wood glue to the joints and then put the pieces together using some clamps, and I also used a framing square just to check that the squares were square. When the glue on the joints had dried, I could then clean up the bridle joints with my block plane. And they looked really nice. The last time I cut bridle joints I had a few gaps because I hadn't checked my table saw blade was at a perfect 90-degree angle to the table, but no such issues this time, which was great. With the 2 squares assembled, next I needed to cut 2 rails that would run in between the 2 squares and support a shelf. So I cut some more pieces to length, ripped them to the approximate size on the table saw, and then planed and thicknessed them in the same way as I had for the pieces for the legs. But once these pieces were cleaned up, I realised that they were lighter in colour and had a totally different grain pattern to the sapele I'd used for the squares. Here you can see the sapele at the bottom looks very different, so the pieces I'd just cut were not sapele at all, and they weren't a good enough match. So I put them to one side, and I'll have to use these for another project some other time. Then I remembered that I had some sapele offcuts from when I made my treasure chest blanket box. So I pulled those out and found a couple of pieces that looked pretty perfect for the rails. So I cut them to length at the miter saw, and then using my marking knife I marked up on the squares where I'd need to cut the joinery for the rails. This marking knife was a recent purchase, and previously I'd always used a pencil to mark up for joints, but I found a marking knife to be so much more accurate. If you're a woodworker and you don't have one, I'd highly recommend picking one up. This one is by Stanley. It's fairly inexpensive. I think it's about £7 or £8 on Amazon. I'll leave a link to it in the description box below. The blades in these are replaceable, and if you want to buy some extra ones, I'd suggest not buying the official Stanley ones because they're very expensive, and instead going over to eBay and looking up the name Swann Morton. I'll leave the details of that in the description box below too, because those blades fit absolutely perfectly and work just as well as the Stanley ones. The rails would be joined to the squares with half lap joints, and with the joinery marked up on the squares, I lined up my table saw blade on the inside of the mark, and I could use my crosscut sled with a stop block attached with a clamp to make the same cut on all of the legs. Then I did the same again, but on the inside of the second mark. And then removed the rest of the material to form the joint, and it was a perfect fit. I cleaned up those cuts with a chisel too. I could then push the rail into the joint that I'd just cut, make sure that the end of it was flush with the leg, and then mark up the waste material on the rails at each end, again using my marking knife. I made those cuts on the bandsaw and then refined them with chisels to get a nice fit. Then I could add glue to the joint and fit the rails using clamps to get tight joints and let the glue set. I sanded the whole frame with 120 grit paper on my random orbit sander. Regular viewers might wonder where I got this new sander from. I bought it, but I'm not totally sure I'm going to keep it yet. I'll probably talk about that a bit more in my next vlog video. I eased over the sharp edges of the table frame with some hand sanding. So at this point the table frame was fairly strong but not particularly rigid. But that wasn't a problem because next I'll be adding a shelf to the rails, which will help to stiffen everything up nicely. I used some reclaimed beech veneered plywood for the shelf. This had some paint on one side. I first wet the grain just to see if it was a good match for the slab tabletop, and it looked like it matched really well. Before making any cuts to the ply, I first checked that the corners were square with my framing square, as I didn't know what cuts had been made to this piece before I found it. After taking some measurements from the table frame, I cut the plywood to length with the circular saw and ripped it to width on the table saw. It was a bit of a tight fit, but it went in okay. I sanded off the worst of the paint from the plywood. This will be the underside of the shelf anyway, so no one will see it. And then I sanded the best side to get it smooth, and also to remove some footprints that were on it. Then I could glue and clamp the shelf onto the rails. Once the glue had set, the frame was nice and solid. With the shelf now fitted, I noticed that part of the grain on the plywood was in need of repair. So I put some glue under there and taped it up, and once dry I did some sanding, and that worked well. It was barely visible. Next I need to cut some trim pieces to cover these plywood edges, and I've got some pieces of beech here which would be a good match for the shelf. Or the other option is to make use of these offcuts of sapele, and I think that will look slightly better, so I think that's what I'm going to do. The plywood measured 11.5mm, so I ripped a trim piece to that width at the table saw and checked it with the calipers before making the rest of the cuts. Then I could mark the trim and cut it to length. I applied glue and taped it on and then added some clamps. I did the same for the short edges too. This piece was cut a fraction too long, so I took a tiny bit off at the end with the disc sander. While I'm waiting for the glue to set on the trim, I'm starting to think about how I'm going to attach the slab to the top. The easiest way would be to simply drill a couple of pilot holes through the top of the frame and install some screws to secure the top down. But as the tabletop is one solid piece of wood, it's likely to expand and contract as the seasons change and humidity levels in the air change. So what I think I'm going to do is use the biscuit jointer to cut some slots in these rails, and then I can make some blocks that will screw into the tabletop and slot into the slot in the rail, and that will allow the tabletop to move across the grain as much as it needs to. The last time I used this biscuit jointer I had nothing but problems. That was back when I built the radio studio desks. So before I use it, I'm just going to make sure that the fence is at a perfect 90-degree angle, and that seems to be okay. I marked up some locations for where I wanted the slots to be on the rails just to keep them all consistent in size, and then made a series of cuts with the biscuit jointer. Then I measured the distance between the bottom of the slot and the top of the frame, which was 14mm, and then I added the thickness of a number 20 biscuit and ripped some scraps of oak to that thickness to make the blocks. I offered up the workpiece and then marked up for a rebate cut. I cut that at the table saw in 2 passes. And then offered it up again, and it was slightly too thick to fit the slot. So I took a few shavings off the bottom of the block with a hand plane, and then it fitted nicely. I cut the workpiece into 4 pieces, 1 for each slot. Then I could drill a pilot hole through the block for the screw. By now the glue on the trim had set, so I could remove the clamps and tape and then sand the edges. Using a chisel, I also carved a round over onto the ends of the trim just to soften the look. I added my maker's mark to the bottom of the shelf. And then I applied boiled linseed oil to the frame, the shelf trim, and the shelf itself. I didn't bother adding any other finishes because the frame of the table really doesn't need to be as hard wearing as the tabletop, which I had used both boiled linseed oil and spray varnish on. Then I could finish off the tabletop blocks. I added a countersink to the underside of them and then screwed in the screws so that they would protrude slightly through the top. I could then add the blocks to the frame Position the slab gently on top, making sure it was positioned evenly. And when I was happy, I pressed it down to make some indentations from the screws onto the bottom of the slab. I could then flip the slab over and, using the indentations, drill pilot holes for the screws. Then I could fasten it down using my shortest screwdriver. This project took around 3.5 days to complete, and originally I was making it as an item to sell, but it turned out really nice, and after working on it for so long I kind of grew quite attached to it, and also when my girlfriend saw it she liked it too, so I think I'm going to keep it. So it's now in my living room, and it's replaced the oak herringbone coffee table that I made a couple of years ago. That was featured as another video on my channel, and I'll link to that in the description box below. For the table frame, I wanted kind of a minimal and mid-century feel to it, and I think it was a success. I really like the way that the sapele contrasts with the beech. It complements the slab really well, I think. Making the frame and doing the joinery was probably the highlight of the project for me, although it was also really rewarding to see the beech slab be transformed from a dirty, rough sawn piece of wood into something that's really nice to look at. Flattening the slab was a lot of hard work, and it was pretty tiring too. My arms ached for days after that. That's it for this project. Thank you for watching as always, and if you haven't already subscribed, please do.